The hospital ship Artemis Vitae was not what anyone expected. A monstrosity of reinforced alloys, shimmering plasma shields, and enough firepower to level a mid-sized fleet, it floated in the inky void like a shark among minnows. The sleek exterior, bristling with turrets and antennae, was painted in stark white, emblazoned with the crimson cross that represented the United Earth Coalition's medical division. But don't let the logo fool you, this wasn't your average flying Florence Nightingale. The Artemis Vitae was designed for war. Not to wage it but to survive it. In the farthest reaches of the Orion Arm, where the line between soldier and victim blurred into a chaotic mess of desperation, it was the last bastion for the broken. The Coalition learned the hard way years ago that fragile hospital ships were nothing but floating coffins when pirates, alien warbands and rogue mercenaries stalked the stars. So they built the Artemis Vitae, a fortress in the void, a haven wrapped in a battleship's body. Inside it was no less intimidating. The corridors were sterile white, but the scent of disinfectant mixed with the faint tang of ozone from the ship's advanced shielding. Automated turrets lined the halls, folding into the walls unless activated. Medics and combat-trained nurses in exosuits moved with purpose, their bootsteps echoing like a rhythm of war drums. The Artemis Vitae was as much a battlefield as the front lines it served, and its crew had long learned to adapt. They weren't ready for what docked that day. Commander Renner, the voice of Lieutenant Abril crackled over the comms, sharp and efficient. "We've got incoming, emergency docking request from Titan's Edge. It's bad. Really bad." Commander Elise Renner stood on the bridge, a grim expression etched onto her weathered face. She was the heart of the Artemis Vitae, a woman who'd spent her entire life walking the line between saving lives and protecting her own. Her uniform was pristine, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen more death than most soldiers in a lifetime. "Define really bad, Lieutenant," Renner replied, though she already suspected the answer. Abril hesitated, a rarity for the typically unflappable officer. "They're carrying refugees from New Thessalonica. Civilians mostly. Some soldiers. Looks like they got caught in a crossfire with the Vixer fleets. The ship's barely holding together. Hull integrity at 16%. Renner's lips tightened. New Thessalonica. The Vixer." The words conjured images of scorched landscapes and cities turned to ash. The Vixer weren't just an enemy, they were a nightmare. An alien species bred for war, relentless in their pursuit of conquest, and utterly indifferent to the concept of mercy. "Bring them in," Renner ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. The Titan's Edge was limping as it approached the docking bay, a Corvette-class ship with its armor peeled back like a gutted fish. Fires burned in its lower decks, visible even in the vacuum of space, and debris trailed behind it like a comet's tail. The docking clamps extended, grabbing the dying ship with mechanical precision. Emergency shielding sprang up, forming a protective barrier to contain any explosions. "Medical teams to Docking Bay 7, Renner barked into the intercom. "Prepare for mass casualties. Security be on alert. If there's any sign of Vixer trackers, I want them neutralized immediately." Docking Bay 7 was chaos incarnate. As the Titan's Edge settled into the berth, its airlocks hissed open, releasing a flood of smoke, sparks, and a cacophony of screams. The first to stumble out were the medics, dragging wounded soldiers on gurneys and hover stretchers. Blood, both crimson and alien green, slicked the deck. Civilians followed, their faces pale and eyes hollow with shock. Dr. Kieran Voss was already there, directing the triage efforts with the precision of a general. He was a man of contradictions, scruffy hair and a perpetually rumpled coat that belied the brilliance of his mind. If Renner was the ship's iron fist, Voss was its beating heart. "Critical cases to Med Bay 1, he shouted, his voice cutting through the din. "Stabilize the rest here. I need blood plasma, dermal regenerators, and someone to fix that goddamn bioscanner." One of the stretchers caught his eye, a soldier barely clinging to life, his armor melted into his flesh from what looked like a plasma blast. Voss knelt beside him, his gloved hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Stay with me, soldier," he murmured, injecting a stabilizer into the man's neck. "We've got you." The soldier's lips moved, forming a single word, "Vixer?" Voss froze. His head snapped up, his gaze locking with one of the security officers. "Double the patrols. If there's even a whisper of a tracker on board." He didn't need to finish. Everyone knew what would happen if the Vixer followed their prey here. Amid the chaos, Renner entered the docking bay, her presence commanding instant attention. She scanned the room, taking in the wounded, the frightened, and the overwhelmed crew. Her jaw clenched as her gaze fell on the children, wide-eyed and clutching their parents, their innocence shattered by the horrors they had witnessed. A young girl no older than 8, sat on the floor clutching a battered stuffed animal. Her face was streaked with soot, and her eyes held a vacant stare that twisted something deep in Renner's chest. Renner knelt beside her, her tone soft but firm. "Hey there, kiddo. What's your name?" The girl blinked slowly, clutching the stuffed toy tighter. "Amara," she whispered. "Well, Amara, you're safe now. We're going to take care of you, all right?" Renner placed a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder, her expression softening. Amara looked up, her gaze flickering to the chaos around them. "Are the monsters coming?" Renner's stomach tightened. She glanced at the security officers, their hands hovering over their weapons. The truth was they didn't know. The Vixer had a habit of leaving no survivors, but when they did, it was rarely without a purpose. "They won't get you," Renner promised, her voice steel beneath the softness. "Not here. Not on my ship." As Renner stood, the lights flickered, a momentary glitch that sent a ripple of unease through the room. She tapped her comms. "Bridge, report." "Power fluctuation in the secondary grid," came the reply. "No cause detected yet." Renner's eyes narrowed. "Yet. Keep me updated. Security, sweep the Titan's edge for any trackers or anomalies. I don't want surprises." The flicker wasn't a coincidence. Renner knew it, Voss knew it, and so did the crew. The Vixer were relentless hunters, and they rarely let prey escape unscathed. If one of their beacons had latched onto the Titan's edge, it wouldn't be long before the Artemis Vitae became the target. Renner turned to Voss. "How bad is it?" "Worst I've seen in years," Voss admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "The civilians are malnourished, dehydrated, and traumatized. The soldiers are in critical condition, third-degree plasma burns, organ damage, you name it. We're running out of resources, Elise." "We'll manage," Renner said firmly. "We always do." As the wounded were stabilized and the civilians were ushered into temporary quarters, a tense calm settled over the ship. But it was the calm before the storm. Renner could feel it in her bones, the same instinct that had kept her alive through a dozen firefights and near-death encounters. The Artemis Vitae wasn't just a hospital ship. It was a fortress, and soon it would have to prove it. The lights flickered again, this time longer, sending a shiver of unease through the crew. Renner didn't need to say a word. Her eyes spoke volumes. The message was clear. Stay sharp on the Artemis Vitae. Vigilance wasn't just a duty, it was survival. In the med bay, the hum of equipment blended with the groans of the injured and the frantic chatter of medics. Voss worked tirelessly, moving from one patient to another like a man possessed. He could hear the faint rumble of distant engines as the Titan's edge powered down completely. That ship wasn't flying again, not without weeks of repairs, and the Artemis Vitae didn't have weeks. "Dr. Voss?" The voice of Lieutenant Abril snapped him out of his focus. She was standing by the door, her usual composed expression replaced with something more urgent. "We've completed the sweep of the Titan's edge. You'll want to see this." Voss sighed, reluctantly peeling off his bloodied gloves. "If it's another hull breach or malfunctioning airlock, I swear I'll—" "It's worse," Abril interrupted. "Much worse." She led him through the maze of corridors, her pace brisk and her hand resting on the pistol at her hip. Voss's gut twisted as they reached the auxiliary cargo hold, where a small team of security officers had gathered around a cluster of devices. The air in the room was thick with tension. "What am I looking at?" Voss asked, stepping closer. A security officer, a grizzled veteran named Kellen, gestured to the devices with a grimace. "Vixer transponders. 3 of them hidden in the Titan's edge's bulkheads. They'd been broadcasting for hours." Voss felt his blood run cold. "Broadcasting to what?" Kellen's voice was low, almost a growl. "To whoever's listening." Abril crossed her arms, her expression dark. "We're sitting ducks, Doctor. If the Vixer know we're here—" "They do," Renner said, striding into the room with her usual air of authority. She glanced at the transponders, her eyes narrowing. "The question isn't if they'll come. It's when." Voss ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "We need to evacuate. Get the refugees onto escape pods, scatter them across the sector. If we stay—" "We're not abandoning this ship," Renner snapped. "The Artemis Vitae is the only thing keeping these people alive. Without us they're as good as dead. But if we stay," Voss countered, "we're painting a target on their backs." Renner's jaw tightened, and for a moment the room was silent. Then she spoke, her voice steady but laced with resolve. "We're not running. Not this time. The Vixer think they can wipe us out? Let them try. This ship isn't a victim. It's a damn fortress. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and slowly the tension began to shift. The security officers straightened, their expressions hardening. Even Voss felt a flicker of something, defiance maybe. Lieutenant Abril, Renner continued, get the crew to battle stations. Lock down all non-essential areas and activate the perimeter defenses. I want turrets online, shields at full power, and every available hand armed and ready. Yes, ma'am, Abril replied, already moving to relay the orders. Renner turned to Voss. Doctor, your job is to keep those people alive. Do whatever it takes. We'll hold the line. Voss hesitated, then nodded. You'd better. I'm not patching you up if you get yourself killed. Renner smirked, a rare flicker of humor breaking through her stoic demeanor. Deal? Hours passed and the ship hummed with activity. The once chaotic medbay had transformed into a tightly run machine, with Voss and his team working like clockwork. Civilians huddled in makeshift shelters, their fear palpable but tempered by the presence of armed guards. In the command center, Renner stood at the helm, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. The holographic projection showed the surrounding space, empty but for the debris field left behind by the Titan's edge. They'll come, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. They always do, Kellen said from his post. The lights dimmed briefly and an alarm blared, cutting through the tense silence. Contact, one of the bridge officers shouted. Multiple signatures dropping out of FTL. Renner's head snapped up. How many? At least 5 ships, the officer replied, his voice tight. Destroyer class. Vixer. The room fell silent, save for the hum of the tactical display. The Vixer ships appeared on the hologram, sleek and angular, their hulls glinting like obsidian. They moved with predatory grace, closing in on the Artemis Vitae. Battle stations, Renner ordered, her voice calm but commanding. Across the ship, the crew sprang into action. Automated turrets emerged from the walls, their barrels swiveling into position. Shield generators hummed to life, casting a faint blue glow over the exterior. The Artemis Vitae wasn't a warship, but it had teeth, and Renner intended to show the Vixer just how sharp they were. As the enemy ships drew closer, Renner opened a comm channel to the lead vessel. This is Commander Elise Renner of the United Earth Coalition Medical Division. You are approaching a humanitarian vessel under protected status. Stand down or be fired upon. The response was immediate and chilling. A guttural voice crackled through the speakers, its tone dripping with malice. Your status means nothing, human. Surrender and we may spare the civilians. Resist and you will all perish. Renner's lips curled into a cold smile. I'll take my chances. She cut the channel and turned to her crew. Target the lead ship. Fire at will. The Artemis Vitae erupted into action. Railguns roared to life, sending hyper-accelerated projectiles streaking toward the Vixer fleet. Missile launchers unleashed their payloads, the explosions lighting up the void like miniature suns. The Vixer ships returned fire, their plasma cannons spitting green bolts of energy that slammed into the Artemis Vitae's shields. The ship shuddered under the impact, but the shields held, for now. In the medbay, the civilians huddled together as the ship rocked. Voss moved among them, offering reassurances he didn't entirely believe. We're going to be fine, he told a frightened mother clutching her child. The commander knows what she's doing. But even as he spoke, his thoughts drifted to the battle raging outside. The Artemis Vitae was strong, but against 5 destroyers? Voss wasn't sure strength would be enough. Back on the bridge, Renner watched as the lead Vixer ship buckled under the Artemis Vitae's onslaught. Its shields collapsed and a well-placed railgun shot tore through its engine core, triggering a massive explosion. One down, Kellen muttered, his tone grim. 4 to go. Renner's gaze hardened. This was just the beginning. The destruction of the lead Vixer destroyer barely slowed the others. If anything, it made them angrier. The remaining ships fanned out, their sleek forms like shadows slicing through the void. Plasma fire rained down in relentless waves, battering the Artemis Vitae's shields. Shields at 72% and dropping, shouted Lieutenant Abril from her station, her fingers flying across the console. They're concentrating fire on our forward sections. Redirect auxiliary power to the shields, Commander Renner ordered, her voice sharp and steady. And tell the gunnery crews to focus on their flanking ships. Keep them from boxing us in. On the tactical display, the Vixer ships adjusted their formation. They were closing the gap, their movements coordinated like a pack of wolves surrounding a wounded prey. The Artemis Vitae fired back with everything it had, railguns, missile barrages, point defense lasers, but it wasn't enough to stop the onslaught. Commander, they're launching boarding pods. Kellen barked, his tone grim. 3, no 5 inbound. Impact in 40 seconds. Renner's stomach tightened. Boarding pods meant the Vixer weren't content to destroy the Artemis Vitae from a distance. They wanted to take it from within. Security teams to critical zones, Renner ordered. Lock down all non-essential areas. If they get through, we funnel them into choke points. Acknowledged, Kellen said, already switching his comms to relay orders. In the medbay, the chaos of the battle outside had seeped into the air. The hum of the ship's shields and the occasional shudder of impact were constant reminders of the danger they were in. Civilians huddled together in groups, their fear almost palpable. Dr. Voss was in the middle of stabilizing a soldier with severe plasma burns when the announcement crackled over the intercom. Attention all crew, enemy boarding pods inbound. Prepare for possible intrusions? Voss cursed under his breath. Because this day wasn't bad enough already, he muttered. Nurse Hannah, a wiry woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her station. Should we move the patients? Move them where? Voss shot back. We're already packed tighter than a sardine can. If the Vixer get in here, we'll just have to. A thunderous crash interrupted him, shaking the medbay to its core. The sound of metal tearing echoed through the walls, followed by the unmistakable screech of Vixer voices. Hold that thought, Voss said grimly. The security team stationed outside the medbay sprang into action, their pulse rifles aimed at the door. The air was thick with tension, the civilians clutching each other as the distant sounds of combat drew closer. The medbay door hissed open and Kellen strode in, his rifle slung across his chest and his face set in a grim mask. Dr. Voss, we've got incoming. Boarding pods breached sections D4 and E2. The Vixer are moving fast, they'll be here in minutes. Voss's jaw tightened. Fantastic. Any chance we can lock them out? Not likely, Kellen said. They've already bypassed the outer bulkheads. If we can't hold them at the next junction, this place is going to turn into a bloodbath. Voss glanced at the civilians, the children, the wounded, the terrified faces that looked to him for reassurance. His mind raced. All right. We'll barricade this room. Get the critical patients behind the inner wall and have the medics ready to move them if things go south. Kellen nodded. I'll station my team here, but we can't hold them forever. If you've got any bright ideas, now's the time. Voss didn't answer. He was too busy improvising. He grabbed a cart loaded with medical supplies, tipping it over to create a makeshift barricade near the entrance. Hannah, grab anything heavy that isn't bolted down. If we can't fight, we'll slow them down. Hannah gave him a flat look but nodded, dragging equipment toward the barricade. On the bridge, Renner watched the tactical display with mounting urgency. The Vixer ships were relentless, their plasma fire chipping away at the Artemis Vitae's defenses. Worse, the boarding pods had latched onto the hull like parasites, disgorging squads of alien warriors into the ship's interior. Report, she barked. Abril's voice was tight. Multiple incursions across decks 4 and 5. Security is engaging, but the Vixer are heavily armed. Medbay reports they're fortifying against an imminent breach. Renner slammed her fist against the console. They're trying to divide us. Keep the pressure on their fleet. If we can take out one more ship, it'll force them to regroup. Easier said than done, Kellen's voice crackled over the comms. We're outnumbered and outgunned down here. They're pushing hard, Commander. If you've got any miracles up there, now's the time to use them. Renner's mind raced. The Artemis Vitae was holding its own for now, but the longer the fight dragged on, the slimmer their chances became. The ship's medical mission didn't allow for offensive armament beyond a certain threshold, but she had one ace up her sleeve, a classified feature built into the ship during its retrofit. Lieutenant Abril, Renner said, her tone grim. Prepare to activate the dagger protocol. Abril froze, her eyes widening. The dagger? Commander, that's a last resort, Renner interrupted. I know. But we're running out of options. Abril nodded reluctantly, her fingers moving across the console. The dagger protocol was a fail-safe, a high-intensity energy weapon integrated into the ship's core. It was never meant to be used in a medical vessel. It was a political concession, a reluctant nod to the realities of war. The bridge crew worked in tense silence as the system powered up. A faint hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. In the medbay, the first wave of Vixer warriors arrived. The security team opened fire, their pulse rifles lighting up the corridor in bursts of blue energy. The Vixer charged forward, their angular bodies covered in organic armor that absorbed much of the initial assault. Hold the line. Kellen shouted, his rifle blazing. The Vixer were relentless, their claws raking against the makeshift barricades as they surged forward. Civilians screamed, the sound cutting through the chaos. Voss grabbed a scalpel, useless he knew, but it was all he had. "Stay behind me," he shouted to the civilians. Hannah, armed with a surgical laser, stood beside him. "This is insane," she muttered, her voice tight with fear. "Welcome to the Artemis Vitae," Voss replied grimly. The Vixer breached the barricade, their guttural roars echoing through the room. The security team fell back, forming a tight line around the civilians. Kellen fired a grenade into the cluster of aliens, the explosion tearing through their ranks. But more kept coming. On the bridge, Renner watched the Dagger protocol reach full charge. "Target the largest remaining ship," she ordered. Abril hesitated. "Commander, the energy backlash." "Do it." The Artemis Vitae shuddered as the Dagger fired, a beam of blinding light lancing through the void. It struck the largest Vixer ship dead center, punching through its shields and igniting its core. The explosion lit up the tactical display, sending debris scattering in all directions. Cheers erupted on the bridge, but Renner wasn't smiling. The Dagger protocol had drained a significant portion of the ship's power, leaving them vulnerable. "Status report," she demanded. "2 enemy ships destroyed," Abril said, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. "The remaining 3 are regrouping, but they're holding back." Renner's eyes narrowed. "They're testing us. They'll be back." In the med bay, the remaining Vixer warriors began to retreat, their guttural roars echoing as they fell back into the corridors. Kellen slumped against the wall, his rifle smoking. "Guess they didn't like the odds," he muttered. Voss exhaled, his hands shaking as he lowered the scalpel. "We're not out of this yet." And he was right. The Artemis Vitae had survived the first wave, but the battle was far from over. The Vixer weren't known for giving up, and Renner knew they would return, with reinforcements. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a siege. The bridge of the Artemis Vitae was quiet but tense, the lull between storms. The tactical display showed the 3 remaining Vixer ships holding their distance, likely recalibrating after the destruction of their destroyer. The Dagger protocol had been a devastating statement of resistance, but Renner knew the Vixer wouldn't retreat without a fight. "Shields at 46%, Abril reported, her voice steady despite the numbers. "Weapon systems operational but severely depleted. Main power at 52%. "Commander, we can't take another wave like that." Renner nodded grimly. "We won't." Her words were resolute, but the truth loomed heavy. The Artemis Vitae was a hospital ship, not a battleship. Every second it stayed in this fight was a second stolen by pure defiance and ingenuity. But time was running out. "Kellen," Renner called through the comms. "What's the status down there?" The reply came after a short pause, Kellen's voice tinged with exhaustion. "The medbay is secure for now. We drove the Vixer back, but we've got wounded among the security team. They'll be coming again, and when they do, we won't have the manpower to hold them off." Renner clenched her fists. "Understood. Keep everyone together. I'll handle it." She cut the comms and turned to Abril. "Open a ship-wide channel." Abril hesitated for a fraction of a second but complied. The intercom crackled, and Renner's voice echoed through every corridor and room of the Artemis Vitae. "This is Commander Renner. I won't sugarcoat it, we're in the fight of our lives. The Vixer don't care about treaties, sanctuaries, or the lives we're trying to save. They came here to destroy us. But this ship isn't just steel and circuits, it's a lifeline for every soul on board. We are not a target. We are not prey. We are humanity's promise to protect and heal no matter the odds. To the crew, to the civilians, stand firm. We are not backing down. We are not running. And we sure as hell aren't giving the Vixer the satisfaction of seeing US break. Stay strong. Renner out." The comms went silent, and for a moment so did the ship. Then, from the medbay to the engine room, a ripple of determination swept through the Artemis Vitae. Civilians helped reinforce barricades. Medics readied supplies for triage. Security officers checked their weapons and armor. Renner turned back to Abril, her expression unyielding. "Send out a distress signal. Burst transmission on every frequency. Someone out there will hear us." Abril nodded, working the console. "Message away. Let's hope we're not too deep in this sector for it to reach anyone." Down in the medbay, Voss was patching up a young soldier with a mangled arm. Despite the pain, the soldier managed a grim smile. "You really think we'll make it, Doc?" Voss didn't look up. "I think if I don't stop the bleeding, you won't have to worry about it." The soldier chuckled weakly. "Fair enough. Voss tightened the bandage and moved on to the next patient. The medbay was running on fumes, supplies were low, energy was dwindling and exhaustion weighed on everyone. But they kept going. A sudden vibration through the floor made Voss freeze. It wasn't the dull thrum of a distant explosion or the shudder of plasma fire against the shields. It was something deeper, closer. Hannah caught his eye. What was that? Before Voss could respond, the lights flickered and the medbay system sputtered. An automated voice echoed through the room. Warning, hull breach detected on Deck 5. Critical failure imminent. The civilians began to panic and Voss felt his pulse quicken. Hannah, get everyone to the inner sanctum, he barked. Now? The medbay erupted into chaos as security officers herded civilians toward safer zones. Voss grabbed a medkit and turned to Kellen, who had just entered the room, sweat streaking his face. Kellen, tell me you've got a plan, Voss said. Kellen gritted his teeth. We hold them here as long as we can. That's the plan. On the bridge, the Vixer ships began to move again, their formation tightening. Renner knew what was coming. They were preparing for an all-out assault. Commander, Abril said, her voice quiet but urgent. If we're going to make it out of this, we need more than prayers. That distress signal, what if no one hears it? Renner's gaze hardened. Then we make sure the Vixer never forget us. The tactical display lit up with new warnings. The Vixer ships were charging their weapons, their intent clear. Abril hesitated, then said, Commander, I've been running power calculations. If we reroute everything, life support, secondary systems, even the engines, we could fire the Dagger protocol again. It might be enough to break their formation. Renner stared at her. We'd leave the ship dead in the water. Yes, Abril said. But it's either that or we get torn apart anyway. Renner didn't like the odds. But Abril was right. This was their only chance. Do it, she said. Reroute all power. Charge the Dagger. The medbay was a war zone. The Vixer had breached the inner corridor, and the security team was barely holding them back. Voss stood behind the barricades, a scalpel in one hand and a surgical laser in the other, ready to defend the civilians with whatever he had. Hannah, how's it looking back there? He shouted. We've got the last group into the sanctum, Hannah called back. But we're out of time, Doc. Kellen fired a burst of his rifle, taking down another Vixer warrior. Fall back, he yelled. Everyone fall back. But before they could retreat, a deep rumble shook the ship. The lights dimmed and the air grew eerily still. On the bridge, the Dagger protocol reached full charge. Renner's hands tightened around the console. Target all 3 ships, she said. If this works, we end it now. Abril nodded, her face pale but resolute. Firing in 3, 1. The ship shuddered as the Dagger fired, its energy beam splitting into 3 lances of blinding light. Each one struck a Vixer ship with pinpoint precision, punching through shields and tearing into their cores. On the tactical display, the 3 ships exploded in rapid succession, their debris scattering across the void. A deafening silence followed. The Artemis Vitae hung in space, its power reserves depleted, its systems barely functional. But the Vixer were gone. Hours later, the survivors gathered in the medbay. The injured were tended to, and the civilians sat in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. Renner entered, her uniform singed and her expression weary but victorious. She looked at Voss and gave a faint smile. Doctor, she said, we made it. Voss exhaled, his shoulders sagging. Barely. But I'll take it. A faint chime echoed through the ship, and Abril's voice crackled over the intercom. Commander, we're picking up a signal. Coalition rescue ships are en route. They'll be here in 6 hours. The room erupted in relieved cheers, but Renner didn't smile. She simply looked at Voss. We survived, she said softly. But this ain't over. The Vixer will come back. Let them, Voss replied. They'll learn the hard way, this ain't your grandma's hospital ship. Outside, the debris of the Vixer fleet drifted silently in the void, a testament to the resilience of the Artemis Vitae. For now they were safe. But tomorrow was another story. And Renner would be ready.